Dr. Kusy, Dr. Benoit, welcome to 12 Geniuses.
Thank you, Dan.
Pleasure to be here, Don.
As I was reflecting on our prep work, change is why this podcast exists. I don't know if you know this, but when I sold my company in 2016, and then I worked for Aon, the company that acquired us, until 2018, I had realized during that 2-year period how much the world had changed while we were building up my company. And I thought, I really want to study this change. I want to study the social changes. I want to study the technological changes. How am I going to do that? And I thought, I want to talk to geniuses from around the world to discover and explore these changes.
I love this. This project was a little bit like that too. I think as Mitch and Mike were looking at building this book, right? They looked at what else is changing, and AI was sort of this big driver of change. And so they decided to kind of invite me to collaborate on this project, and that was really fun.
Actually, that's a funny story because Mike Valentine is our co-author of the Playbook for Leading Change. And early on, he said, when we were writing this book about the 5 proven strategies for leading change, Mitch, shouldn't we enter into the field of AI? I said, no, I can't. I said, I know nothing about this. And then my partner of almost 40 years, Scott, he's shoving me articles from the Wall Street Journal about AI. I said, I can't. And then this brilliant Gilles, we're having dinner. Gilles is one of my best friends, and we're having dinner. And he said, Mitch, AI is not about, replacing change. It's a way to accelerate change, and not only organizational change, but change in our personal lives. I was reborn.
Before we get too far ahead of ourselves, Gilles, why don't you talk about your background and how you got to where you are now?
Yeah, absolutely. I'd love to. So, I really consider myself an engineer at heart. I grew up in France, was fascinated by science, and in particular, how you can turn science into technology and companies that can shape the world. I think to some extent, I got that from my mom. She was an engineer herself and kind of taught me to be curious about the world. And so that curiosity is what eventually led me to MIT and get a PhD in material science, which of course is a bit of a dream because MIT's mission is largely to turn technology into companies, right? So it was a perfect fit. And then eventually landed at 3M, where for the early part of my career, I did fairly traditional product development. But then something changed. About 15 years ago, I started looking at AI and one fundamental problem about AI, which is computers are good at finding patterns and correlations. Like they will find cells are jumping on Tuesdays, for example, right? But they don't tell you why. And so I sort of pivoted my whole career towards how can we address this fundamental issue and teach computers to actually understand cause and effect relationships. Because if you're a leader and you want to use AI to make good decisions, especially in situations where your decisions can have a huge impact, think, finance, supply chain, manufacturing, you need to understand what's driving the outcome, not just what's happening, right? It's not just being descriptive, it's about being prescriptive and actually, driving change in the direction that you want, right? And that's really been sort of my journey at 3M, and it's been widely successful. And what I found super interesting is actually a lot of overlap with the book, because the book is also about cutting through the noise. It's about helping leaders find the precision to make better decisions that really will have a greater impact ultimately.
Your book is called The Playbook for Leading Change. Mitch, why did you want to write this book?
When I got approached by Mike Valentine, our co-author, to start thinking about this book, I was so engaged because this was my opportunity to take my background as both a researcher and also a practitioner. And that's where Gilles and I come hand in hand. Gilles is a practitioner. As he mentioned, he's an engineer. I'm a practitioner, an organizational psychologist that studies work culture, and a researcher. And this was my opportunity to say, you know what, let's take the best of the best research that's out there on leading change. Let's consolidate it, which is the 5 proven strategies that we talk about in the book. And then thanks to Gilles, let's give it a special twist. Let's use AI as the accelerator to bring about more effective change. So metaphorically speaking, what we do is we take these 5 proven change strategies and we say, Metaphorically speaking, don't just take our word for it. Let's see what AI has to say about some of the things. And one of the things that Gilles just mentioned is decision making. We've got this decision making strategy and strategic planning, et cetera. Now, let's ramp it up with AI. So I was so intrigued, and it was a learning opportunity for me. So that's the bottom line for me. It was a great way for me to learn.
Now, this next question might be evident for most people listening, but let's talk about the forces driving change today, because you may argue that change is not happening faster than ever. I would say that it is, and it's only going to get faster. But Mitch, what do you see as the primary forces of driving change?
Let me share with you for the drivers that when we know about these, they resist change. But then I want to talk about one that you mentioned earlier, fear. So there's four: dissatisfaction. In order to bring about change, personal change or change in teams or organizations, you've got to have dissatisfaction with the status quo. If there isn't dissatisfaction, then we have to create that dissatisfaction. It sounds like an oxymoron, but when you think about it, yeah, you got to be dissatisfied. Okay, so call that D, dissatisfaction. You got to have vision, and not the organization's visions, but you have to understand, why are we doing this change? What is it that we need? So we need to understand what this change is going to get us, that vision. The F, you need to have first steps, according to Beckert and Harris. So the first steps could be, what are my personal first steps? What's the team's first steps? What's the organization's first steps? And when we have those three pieces, dissatisfaction, the vision of where we're going with this, and first steps, then we're going to have less resistance. Now, let me put my own interpolation on this. Take those first steps and let's translate that to fear. We need to understand the fear of what's preventing people from bringing about change. And so we need to ask questions about this. And what I find is, often we as leaders and we as change agents ourselves don't look at what fear is preventing me from bringing about change. So bringing fear out into the open, along with Beckert and Harris's change formula.
Mm-hmm. Gilles, do you want to comment?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, as an engineer, I love that Mitch can put an equation on change. It's so cool. Like, but yeah, I mean, maybe going back a little bit to the root of your original question, I think the forces that drive change haven't necessarily changed over time. But the one thing that has changed is that one of them is sort of overwhelming everything else, right? Technology it's driving everything else, from, technology itself, but politics, human relationship, health, all these things. And it's doing it at a pace that's just faster and faster. In fact, technology is sort of starting to drive change at a pace that's beyond our ability as humans to adapt to it and to keep up with it. And to make things worse, the social and institutional systems are not evolving as fast. And so a lot of that technology rollout is actually happening with fewer and fewer checks, right? What I find interesting, and what I kind of learned from Mitch and Mike, is the same thing actually happens in the workplace. One day you walk in the office and change is here, right? We got a new system, we have a new structure, we have a new process. And oftentimes it is actually fueled by technology, right? Supercharged by technology. It happens really fast. But the human transition that happens after that change, after that sort of destabilizing event, that happens on a different scale, right? And leaders who recognize that there is a gap between the speed at which change occurs and the pace at which human transition happens after that. And if you recognize that gap, and if you slow down things just enough that people can actually feel supported through that transition, that's where you can really drive change in organizations.
Whenever people talk about rolling something out, what I've discovered in this change process, what they haven't done enough of, is involve people earlier on. If there's one strategy that we're talking about here that relates to exactly what you're talking about, Gilles, is to talk about the change earlier on, engage people earlier on. If we had more time, as a psychologist, I have a 10-point perfectionism scale. And I asked people to rate themselves on this perfectionism. And one of the things I've discovered is often our perfectionism keeps us from engaging people earlier on. Because what if I hear things I don't want to do? And I'm thinking, that's great, because that's the purpose of engagement. If you're engaging people early on just because you want to validate what you're about to do, I say don't do it. You really have to keep an open mind. So, exactly what you said, Gilles, about this rollout concept, use that as a moniker to think about how can I engage people earlier on than I typically do?
I just returned from Japan and Korea, and aging and longevity are two massive, massive forces driving change there. The world is aging, many countries are aging, and they're going to have to deal with that. And in order to deal with these changes, we're going to have to embrace immigration, maybe multi generational living. We might have to rely heavily on robots, or we're going to have to work longer. And so I find that to be an interesting force that is driving change. What do you guys think?
Obviously, it's not a problem that's specific to Japan. I think a lot of modern societies are affected by the same transition, right? Pretty much every continent these days. And like we were saying, it's not an abrupt change, right? It's sort of a transition we have to walk through as a society and understand where we come from, what that transition looks like, and what vision for the future can we put in place to try best that we can tackle the issues that will be associated with all the population. Obviously, I think sort of thinking of the process and walking through it is the best way to come up with rational solutions for how we move forward. The solutions aren't obvious, but at least using processes like the ones we have in the book to really understand that you have to go through those phases of transitions and build the right tools and implement the right tools at the right time is going to be sort of the key to success then.
I sometimes think we have to do change perfectly, either with ourselves or in our organizations or our teams. And we say, take a little leap, don't have to do it all.
Recently, I taught a class at the University of Minnesota for the Osher Lifelong Learning Institute. And the class is called The Future of Aging Reimagined. And it's 60-year-olds, 70-year-olds, and a few 80-year-olds, about 40 people in the class. And I asked this question. I said, look 10 years out. How do you want your life to be in 10 years? And the group got very, very uncomfortable.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, it's because they don't think, some of them think, well, 10 years out, what will I look like? Will I be alive? And I said, don't take that into consideration. Just imagine it. How do you want it to be? And the body language of the group changed dramatically. They kind of opened up. So there was this fear, but then there was this opening up. And then one woman said, I'm 78 right now, and I have 5 granddaughters, ages 8 to 18. She said, when I'm 88, I want to have dinner with them as women. And I said, oh, that's fantastic. Now, what do you have to have? What does 3 years look like? What does a year from now look like? What does tomorrow look like? Like you were saying, the first step, the baby step. You don't have to have 3 years mapped out, but pick a destination 10 years from now, and then let's take that first step.
Exactly.
And the whole group, every single one of them got into it, leaned into it. There was this absence of fear. That fear was taken away, and then they were like, oh, I have permission to dream. It was so cool.
Well, you're enacting the change formula right there.
Right? I know. Don is a pro. I think that question was super interesting, but almost looking at it from an aging population standpoint is almost limiting, because what I see is the same fear is happening in pretty much the rest of the population, with AI now allegedly taking everybody's jobs, right? They're actually in the same position of, what does my future looks like 10 years from now, right? Where do I need to build skills so that I stay relevant in this society, right? And it's affecting everyone, including young people now are deciding, maybe I don't want to do STEM or technology because these things are going to be taken over by AI. Hopefully that's not what ends up happening, but it's certainly a factor that people have to think about.
Gilles, I want to jump back to you
Yep.
and ask you why you see organizations resisting change so much, because I think you have some really interesting takes on this as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And the funny thing is, it's not a question I never really asked myself much, while I was working full time at 3M. I think one of the benefits of working with Mike and Mitch on this book is that it forced me to take a step back and actually think of these questions and learn something from them. And the one thing that became very apparent is people don't resist change because they want to be difficult, obviously. They do it because they are protective, and they're protective because of a sense of fear, which I think the book ties to four factors that are all interconnected to one another. The first one is identity, sort of that fear of losing expertise or status or control. AI is one of those threats, right? The second one is belief. Do I actually believe that this change is going to be successful? Is it necessary, or is it just going to be something that rolls back at the end of the day? And took a lot of energy from me. I'm preparedness. Am I ready for this change? Can I actually lead this change? Do I have the skills, the information, the resources that I needed? And then the last one is capacity, right? A lot of people have fear of change simply because they can afford to have one more thing on their plate. They don't have the resources really to drive it. All of them are interconnected to one underlying message, which is self-protection, essentially. People are trying to self-protect from change because they feel threatened by it. And that's just the reality. It's not a flaw in people. It's just, that's what people do. They want to feel safe. And so resistance is sort of like your mind essentially scanning the horizon for threats and raising a bunch of red flags, right? What was super interesting from learning from Mike and Mitch is that resistance itself is not the problem, is not the danger for organizations. The real danger is silence, when people don't even speak about it. Because if they don't express that fear, their leaders are blind, right? But if they do express fear, the good leaders will jump on that. They will recognize, they will use that as feedback, right? And actually sort of understand that they need to address that fear first before they can move forward with the change. And so it becomes less about trying to convince them that their fears are not, you know, are unfounded. It's more about listening and asking, okay, I hear you. What are you actually afraid of losing here with this change? What do you need to be successful? And so, little by little, by using the practices from the book, you start turning that resistance from something negative to actually a momentum to drive change moving forward.
Going back to the book, The Playbook for Leading Change, two strategies we talk about in the book are script it and name it. So if we have difficulty talking about a specific change, or you're a leader in an organization and you need to get others to talk about this change, we say, first of all, script it. Script it ahead of time and try it out with others. We don't do these things when we're leading change. We think it happens through osmosis. So, first is to script it. And the second is to name it. The example would be if it's fear. My fear is not about meeting right now, but my fear is one that I may not be successful. So by scripting it ahead of time, if it's a conversation with others that you need to have, and then by naming what it is, we will be more successful at change. Whether that change is one-on-one with ourselves, with in terms of Mitch for his retirement, or if we're a leader in an organization or a community action agency or an educational institution, whatever it is, both those strategies will help bring about change in a more successful way.
I have come to the realization that a moral leader is somebody who identifies how the members of their team can be relevant 3 years from now. Look out 3 years from now, understand what their capabilities are, what their skills are, where they want to go with their career, and what sorts of skills and capabilities they need to build in. If you're looking out 3 months from now, all you're writing is pink slips, right? But if you're looking 3 years out, wow, we can collaborate together. We can guarantee that you're relevant. So you've written this playbook for leading organizational change. How does the playbook help leaders imagine that future for their people?
If you're coaching someone and you want to help them with their career 3 years down the road, just don't talk to them about it. actually place it and write it in as part of their career development. And so it's not just scripting it and naming it, it's also having periodic conversations about this with the person. I can tell you, as a consultant and an organizational psychologist, that leaders say they do this. And when I talk with them one on one, it goes by the wayside. That's why you need to place it on something that's part of a form, part of a process in the organization, and then have periodic conversations with the individual about what they are doing for their career and what you as a leader are helping them support.
When I hear you say that, it helps mitigate the things that Gilles just talked about, right? My capabilities, my identity, these things that are fear producing. And I think that's so powerful.
Yeah, yeah. Don, there was something I loved about how you framed the question with around sort of the moral leader and not just making sure people succeed 3 months from now, but 3 years from now, right? The thing is, like we said, right, change is happening faster and faster than ever. And there's not much you can do about it, right? This is all driven by external factors. What you can do is how you think about it and how you get ready for it. And it's a little bit like muscle memory. If you go through it, a few times, it gets a little bit easier and easier. The playbook gives you the tools to do that, but as a leader, you can also, transfer that knowledge and those practices to your team so they can tackle the next change that, comes along the way. Now, one of the tools that we explored in the playbook, and that was, my primary contribution, is how can we use in these leadership positions emerging tools like AI that's now available to pretty much anyone, right? You can go on ChatGPT and others to use it. How can we leverage these tools to tackle that change more effectively and also respond faster to it? And so in the book, we provide examples and a number of prompts to help leaders leverage AI. It could be to better understand the nature of the change they're facing, to better communicate that change in a way that actually resonates with the team for their particular cultural environment. Importantly, to also anticipate the ripple effects before they become problems, because change does not happen in a vacuum and your team is not in a vacuum. It's interconnected with the rest of the company, right? And also to help you track your progress over time. But understanding those ripple effects of what you do affects the rest of the organization, it helps you see beyond the change. It's not just, like to your point, it's not just what happens in 3 months. It's how do we anticipate how people will respond to that change in the long term, right? How does it impact their confidence, their roles, their sense of purpose? And we found that these tools, these AI tools, simple prompts, even as authors, we were really surprised even by the value that they can bring. And so we sort of took it one step further and actually created our own little AI change assistant that you can use on our website, the leading change playbook.com. It's essentially like a virtual change coach or change expert that can help you in various ways. We have an AI coach that can help you diagnose your situation by asking you questions. We have an AI consultant that will help you find what are the right solutions in the book for your particular situation. And then we have an AI planner that you can use with your team to actually create collaboratively an action plan that everybody can execute on. And these tools help you make better decisions, but also they help you tackle change faster and actually try to keep up with the pace of change itself, right? Because if change is fast, the natural thing is you have to respond faster. And these AI tools, they will not give you the solution, but they will help you at least make progress a little bit faster.
There are four pieces that make up a team culture, organization culture. First is values. What's important to us? Beliefs, why these values are important to us. Norms, the unwritten rules, how we make decisions around here. And finally, underlying assumptions, how we go about in very specific ways making decisions. And one of the things I learned from Gilles in writing this book is when we set up a culture where AI is supportive of us, and when we determine how we're going to use AI to accelerate the change that we are already engaged in, That's how you improve the probability of change success.
I want to respond to Gilles, your comments on 3 years out being a long time and that there's going to be a lot of change. And how can a leader possibly prepare their people for work 3 years from now? And it's not necessarily what specific work skills they will need, but I feel like a leader can help foster a sense of curiosity and build agility and resilience and a sense of optimism. I think these are really, really important things that a leader can use and influence people to embrace. Oh, and one other thing that I know you wanted to comment on, Mitch, is connection.
Yes.
Leaders can enable connections or encourage connections, which to me is so vital for the future.
The connection piece is key. And I'm going to give an example that I've observed with you, Don. Don, for the viewers, used to live in the 40-story building, that condo building that we live in Minneapolis. And I was in an elevator one time, and you were with your two girls, and one of them asked a question, and your response was this. What are your two girls' names?
Quinn and Greta.
Quinn and Greta. I don't know which one it was, but you
I think it
said,
was Quinn.
what was Quinn?
It was Quinn, yeah.
That question, you know what? You're a leader. Do you remember that? I was with my partner, Scott, and we were in the elevator. We got off the elevator. I said, oh my gosh, what is happening here is that you're a coach and a mentor to your two girls. It was powerful.
Thank you. It means a lot to me, Mitch. Honestly, it does.
Well, it was so impressive to both of us. And so I bring this home here. It's a very simple process. And I say to anyone watching this, and leaders, anyone who has positive influence, I like to say positive influence with others, is what are you doing in those moments that are the brilliant moments when you could be saying something or modeling something to others? It could be this performance management process where you're saying, I want to support your career 3 years from now. Let's find out what we can do 6 months from now. Let's talk about this and let's have periodic conversations, just like you did with your two girls. And that was so powerful to me. It's a simple strategy that many leaders don't do.
Mm-hmm. I don't want to steal thunder here, but one of my favorite quotes from him from the book is the one at the end of the book, which is leading is teaching. And if you're not teaching, you're not leading. Right. And I think it is so powerful. And actually, when you frame it that way, first of all, anyone is a leader, right? Teach other people around you. And it can be, upwards or downwards, right? Sometimes we have to educate even our peers or, people higher in the organization about technology and things like that. And I think it's such a powerful way of defining leadership and very universal, but also very practical in many ways.
Mitch, earlier in the conversation, you talked about the 5 proven strategies that are outlined in this playbook. Can you talk about what those are?
Where this came from is hundreds and hundreds of research studies. All right, the first one is frame the evidence for change. Sounds simple. When I'm working with leaders all over the world, one of the things I hear when they want to bring about change, and they sometimes want to engage others in change, and they provide their own reasons for bringing about change, but they don't look to key evidence that's out there, what's bringing about the change. They don't look to marking organizations, etc. So first of all, we need to frame the evidence for change in very simple ways. And one of the things we say in the book is both quantitative data and qualitative data. The second one, I'll throw it to you, Gilles, is assess with engagement.
Yeah, it's essentially really trying to understand how the team and the organization is going to respond to that change, right? Sort of like identifying a lot of these fear factors that we, talked about earlier, and anticipating the impact that they're going to have in terms of how the change is being rolled out. Also assessing, the level of capacity and capabilities of the teams to actually act on that change, right? The next one is embrace systems thinking, which is sort of that ripple effect that we also talked about earlier, right? Like how your actions are going to impact the rest of the organization, right? Across functions, across divisions, across the organization. Mitch?
And the fourth one is target results and outcomes. And Don, this is what's key here, the word and. Let me give the example here. A result could be that our customer service scores have improved based upon what customers have said. However, let's just say this is a healthcare institution. The service scores improved. That's the result. The outcome could be, has this translated into more effective distribution of medications in the organization? Or is this translated into patients being discharged earlier from the hospital with positive results? So that's the fourth one, targeting results and outcomes. And we give strategies for demonstrating that. And then finally, the fifth one is ensure sustainability of what works. Again, this is the power of baby steps. So you've been successful with any of these four proven strategies, and now we want to sustain the effort. People want to do it all. We talk about singleness of purpose. What are the one or two things that you can do to help sustain this effort? That would be a great thing to ask AI as well. The team that's come up with these, AI help us uncover anything else that might support our effort here. So those are the five proven change strategies.
Yeah, and maybe just to add something quick, we want people you don't have to apply them sequentially. In fact, a good example of that is don't wait until the end to define what the results and outcomes might be. Like what you actually want to see that change to accomplish, right? Define that upfront because it helps you then put the processes to get those outcomes that are the most impactful for the organization.
For people in organizations to remain relevant, they are going to have to change. You're not doing the same thing that you did when you started your career. I'm not, none of us are. And so change is mandatory within organizations, but that's not the only place where it's mandatory. It's mandatory as individuals too. The difference is that we do have bosses, we have peers, we have expectations in the workplace. Out in the wild out here, we don't have those things. We don't have those systems in place to hold us accountable. So how does this playbook apply to individuals in their personal lives?
Driving change when someone is telling you to change is one thing, but doing it on your own can be, difficult. And actually, that's where the playbook becomes even more valuable in some ways. So Mike, our third co-author, wrote chapter 2, which is about teams transition, but actually it starts this chapter with a very personal story, which is about personal change. And what he explains is that the barrier to change isn't change itself. It's the transition that comes with the change. And the playbook describes that transition with 3 phases. There is the letting go phase, the neutral zone, and the new beginnings. Let's take an example of someone who's, decides, hey, I want to get in shape and I want to start a new, exercise routine, right? The first thing is actually letting go of your past identity or, hey, I'm not someone who walks out. I'm not one of those gym buffs, right? And that can be uncomfortable. And a lot of people skip that part, but it's actually really, really important to let go of that identity that you used to have, right? Then comes the messy middle, which is you don't have an old routine anymore, but you're also not fully acclimated to the new routine. It doesn't feel, natural or automatic quite yet. And that part is difficult. And a lot of people say, hey, I can do this. I'm just going to quit, right? But they're really not failing. The reality is they're just going through that really hard middle part. And then eventually, as you walk through it, you little by little build a new identity that, starts to feel natural. And that's where you sort of emerge from that transition and really the change takes place. What I find so fascinating, and that chapter makes the point of you can leverage that experience, that personal experience, and leverage all those tools in the workplace, right? So it's sort of a two-way street in a way. you learn in leading change in the workplace can help you in your personal life, but vice versa. When you're learning it in your personal life, this can actually help you become sort of like one of those future leaders for the organizations because you've gone through those transition steps. You can teach others, like we've been saying, right, how to go through it. And eventually you learn not just survive the change, but actually learn how to lead people through it.
And just like Gilles had 3 when he talked about the team transitions, I'll give 3, Don, to your question. Make it public, track what you're doing, and find the sweet spot. We talk about this in the playbook for leading change. Make it public. I learned this when I was a PhD student, many, many years ago. Number of studies about this. When we have a goal and we want to bring about a change, and since your question was about yours truly, us, if you tell someone about that goal that you're working on, you have a higher probability of success. So that's first, make it public.
How important is it to have an accountability partner or somebody who holds you accountable?
That's exactly what we're talking about.
And that's what you're trying to accomplish there.
Accountability
I got you.
partners.
Okay.
So that's the first.
So it's not just throwing it out there and saying, "Hey, Mitch, I'm planning to do this." You asked me about it 3 months later and say, "Hey, Don, you said you wanted to do this." And
I like that language. In fact, I should change it. Rather than make it public, find an accountability partner. That's brilliant, Don. You could be doing this. Well, you are doing this. So the second one is track what you're doing. And this is from a psychological principle. Whenever we assess what we're doing, and if you can do it pencil and paper, computer, etc., whenever we assess, even though we don't do anything differently, if you want to lose weight, you're not changing what you're going to intake, you simply start assessing. You will have a higher probability of achieving the goal that you ultimately come up with. So the first is make it public, find an accountability partner. And the second is track what you're doing. The third, find your sweet spot. I'm going to describe this and find your sweet spot. On the x-axis is anxiety from low to high. So whenever you want to make a change, it causes anxiety in us. On the y-axis is productivity. And when I ask leaders, what does the graph look like from x-axis anxiety, y-axis productivity? They say it's a straight line like this. I say, no, it's really not. It's a bell-shaped curve. So as anxiety increases, so does productivity to some point. We call that the sweet spot. And then productivity declines. So in terms of personal change, which is the question you asked us about, what we know is we want to ramp up the fire just a little bit. Maybe ramping up the fire is having an accountability partner. And we ramp up the fire a little bit. That increases our productivity, but don't try to do too much. So keep it simple, keep it manageable, but a little bit of anxiety goes a long way.
really quickly, Gilles, provide us with some final advice for leaders who are trying to enact organizational change.
The first one, and like Mitch mentioned earlier, baby steps, right? Start somewhere. So I would say if you're in a workplace, pick a change that's currently happening to you, get together with your team and be brutally honest about, do we understand the problem? Do we have the resources to tackle it? And then together come up with an action plan. Because when you put it together as a team, the team will not just execute the plan, but they'll actually advocate for it because they feel like, they see themselves in the plan. And then the second one is, of course, don't be afraid of using AI. Do it responsibly. Don't go put, sensitive information in it, but leverage it to do the hard work, like data synthesis, scenario planning, documentation, everything that's tedious, and then save your time for the things that humans are uniquely good at, such as, building trust or addressing the fears of the team or helping people find their new place in the reality that's unfolding through that transition. So these will be my 2 tips.
Mitch, you are a change whisperer. So give us some advice for individual change. What can we do to more effectively change as individuals?
I love that change whisperer too. First, I'm going to share the one that Gilles talked about earlier. I learned this in my American Express days years and years ago in the 80s. To be a leader is to teach. If you're not teaching, you're not leading. Teach someone one thing you learned just today. And the second is, this is the change whisperer. And I discovered this in working with Gilles and Mike, our co-author, is many leaders don't even know how to create an AI prompt. I
Hmm.
didn't know how till Gilles taught me. So the change whisperer, if you don't know how to create an AI prompt, it's so important. You can even ask AI, help me create a prompt. It's incredible. And we talk about this in our book, The Playbook for Leading Change.
Fabulous conversation. Mitch and Gilles, thank you for being geniuses.